The day I came home and found my life's work buried under thousands of tons of dirt, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong property. And the people responsible called it a favor. 3 months later, they were staring down a lawsuit that would destroy everything they thought they controlled. My name is Ethan Cross. I'm 52 years old, and for most of my life, I've made a living pulling stone out of the ground. Not glamorous work. Nobody puts quarry operators on magazine covers. Nobody makes movies about guys covered in limestone dust driving worn-out loaders before sunrise. But it's honest work, and for nearly 15 years, it had given me something I was proud of. My quarry sat outside a small Tennessee town called Red Hollow. 8 acres of limestone and shale, carved one careful bench at a time. My father used to tell me that stone teaches patience because it doesn't care how bad you want it. You earn every foot. He was right. The layer I was after wasn't ordinary limestone either. Deep below the surface sat a blue-gray vein that contractors loved. Strong, clean, beautiful and polished. The kind of stone that ended up in courthouse entrances, luxury homes, and expensive outdoor patios people posted online to show off to their neighbors. Getting to it had taken almost 14 years. 14 years of blasting permits, equipment loans, broken hydraulic lines, fuel bills, inspections, and enough stress to turn my hair gray before I hit 45. Still, every morning when I drove through that gate, I felt proud. Then came the highway project. A contractor I knew offered me a 5-week drilling and blasting job in Kentucky. Good money. The kind of contract you don't refuse when you're self-employed. Before leaving, I did what I always did. I walked the quarry, checked pumps, checked drainage, locked storage containers, covered exposed sections of blue stone, made sure everything was secure. I remember standing on the rim during sunset the night before I left. The quarry looked beautiful. Clean benches, sharp cuts, everything exactly where it should be. If somebody had told me that would be the last time I'd ever see it that way, I would have laughed. 5 weeks later, I drove home. About 2 miles from the property, I noticed something strange. Dust. Not limestone dust. Red clay. Thick enough to hang in the air. I remember frowning and thinking maybe a neighboring farmer was grading a field. Then I turned onto my access road. My stomach dropped. The quarry was gone. Not damaged. Not vandalized. Gone. Where there should have been a 40-foot drop into clean stone benches, there was flat ground. Flat. I actually stopped my truck in the middle of the road and just stared through the windshield. For a second, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. I got out, walked forward, looked again. Same result. The pit had been filled. Thousands of tons of dirt, construction debris, broken concrete, chunks of asphalt, tree stumps, scrap metal, all dumped directly into my quarry until the entire entrance looked like an oversized vacant lot. I remember laughing. Not because it was funny, because sometimes reality arrives so hard your mind glitches. I stood there with my hands on my hips and said out loud, well, that can't be right. The gate lock had been cut. Fresh tire tracks covered the property. There were dozens of them. Different sizes. Different tread patterns. This hadn't been one truck. This had been an operation. Whoever did it had spent weeks doing it. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I drove straight to the county records office. One thing I've learned in construction is that people leave paper trails, especially when they think they're right. It took less than 2 hours to find what I needed. 37 disposal records, 41 dump manifests, every single one linked to the same source. Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I stared at the paperwork and felt something cold settle into my chest. Because I knew Cedar Ridge. Everybody in town knew Cedar Ridge. Big subdivision. Perfect lawns. Matching mailboxes. Neighborhood newsletters. Committees for everything. And at the center of all of it was their HOA president, Richard Whitmore, a man I crossed paths with more than once. The kind of guy who always spoke like he was running for office. The kind of guy who never asked for anything. He announced things, and suddenly I had a very uncomfortable feeling that this wasn't some misunderstanding. This was personal, so I picked up my phone, found his number, and made a call that would end up changing both of our lives. The moment Richard answered, I knew things were about to get a whole lot worse. The moment Richard answered, I knew things were about to get a whole lot worse. His voice was calm, Too calm. Ethan, he said, I had a feeling you'd be calling. That sentence alone made my blood pressure jump. I looked out across the mountain of dirt sitting where my quarry used to be and said, Richard, why is your neighborhood inside my property? There was a pause. Not confusion. Not surprise. A pause from somebody deciding how much truth they wanted to admit. Finally, he sighed. Ethan, some residents had serious concerns. I actually laughed. Concerns? Children were getting close to the quarry. They weren't. Property values were suffering. I shook my head. My permits are current. The community felt action was necessary. Action. That's the word he used. Like they planted flowers. Like they organized a neighborhood picnic. Not like they dumped thousands of tons of debris into a licensed commercial quarry. Then he delivered the part that still makes me smile today for all the wrong reasons. We solved a dangerous situation. Solved. I stared at the dirt pile. Richard, are you honestly telling me your HOA decided it had authority over my property? His tone hardened slightly. The board voted unanimously. I remember saying, good thing ownership isn't determined by voting. That irritated him. I could hear it immediately. Ethan, the quarry has been a source of complaints for years. There are legal channels for complaints. We believed immediate action was necessary. Then he said something that changed the entire case. Something so arrogant that even my attorney later called it a gift from heaven. We were tired of waiting for you to do the right thing. I didn't answer for a second, because suddenly I understood. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about kids. This wasn't about property values. This was about control. The quarry had bothered them for years. The noise, the trucks, the blasting. The simple fact that a working industrial site existed next to their carefully curated suburban dream. And instead of working through the law, they decided to eliminate the problem themselves. Before hanging up, Richard added one more thing. The board expects reimbursement for the fill operation. I actually thought I'd misheard him. What? The association spent significant resources stabilizing the site. I laughed so hard I had to sit down on my truck bumper. He wasn't joking. They genuinely intended to bill me for burying my own quarry. When the call ended, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned itself out. What replaced it was something colder. Focus. That evening I dug through old files and property records until nearly midnight. Most people don't understand how mineral rights work. I barely understood them myself when my father first explained them years ago. But buried inside a fireproof lockbox was a document that changed everything. The original mineral estate deed. Signed decades earlier. Recorded properly. Still active. Still enforceable. The language was crystal clear. The mineral estate carried protected extraction rights. Interference wasn't simply a property dispute. Under certain circumstances, it could become a major civil violation. The next morning I drove 3 hours to meet an attorney named Claire Holloway. Now Claire wasn't flashy. No giant office. No expensive artwork. No dramatic courtroom energy. She looked more like somebody who owned horses than somebody who sued people. But the moment she finished reading the documents, she leaned back in her chair and said something I will never forget. They did what? I explained everything again. The dumping, the debris, the HOA vote, the phone call, the reimbursement demand. When I finished, she sat quietly for a few seconds. Then she looked up. Ethan, this is one of the dumbest things I've ever seen. Those were her exact words. I felt better immediately. She started asking questions. Did they know the quarry was active? Yes. Did they know it was permitted? Yes. Did they know I was temporarily out of town? Yes. Did they obtain written authorization? No. Environmental approval? No. Mining authorization? No. Property access agreement? No. Every answer made her smile a little more. Finally, she closed the file. This isn't a zoning disagreement. What is it? It's interference with a mineral estate. I could tell by her expression that those words mattered. A lot. Within 48 hours, she filed complaints with state regulators and requested an emergency investigation. That's when a state inspector named Marcus Reed entered the story. Marcus looked exactly how you'd expect a mining inspector to look. Sunburned, heavy boots, permanent, a man who appeared to trust rocks more than people. When he arrived at the quarry, He spent nearly 2 hours saying very little. He walked, measured, photographed, collected samples, examined debris, checked permits, reviewed records. The entire time I followed behind him, wondering what he was thinking. Finally, he stopped near the edge of the fill, picked up a chunk of broken asphalt, looked at me, and asked one question. This quarry active when they dumped all this? Every permit's current. He nodded slowly, then looked back across the property. Well, he said, that's going to be a problem. The understatement almost made me laugh. Over the next week, investigators became regular visitors. Survey crews, environmental specialists, mining officials, lawyers. At one point, there were more people examining my quarry than had worked there in the previous year. Then came the breakthrough. The state subpoenaed HOA communications. And that's where Richard's confidence finally started collapsing. Because buried inside board emails was evidence nobody expected to find. One message, one sentence, written 3 weeks before the dumping began. I remember Claire calling me the moment she received it. Her voice sounded almost cheerful. Ethan, yeah. You sitting down? No, you should. Then she read the email. Richard had written to board members. Ethan Cross will be away for several weeks. This may be our best opportunity to resolve the quarry issue permanently. I didn't speak. For a few seconds, I just stared across my kitchen. Because there it was. The truth. Not a misunderstanding. Not confusion. Not safety. Planning. Intent. Timing. Strategy. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they deliberately waited until I was gone. A few days later, the state issued its preliminary findings. I still have a copy. The language was professional, measured, careful, but the meaning was devastating. The HOA was ordered to remove every load of foreign material placed inside the quarry, at their expense, under state supervision. Failure to comply would trigger enforcement actions and additional penalties. When Richard called me that evening, he sounded like a completely different man. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the authority. Gone was the guy who announced decisions like a king issuing decrees. Now he sounded worried. Ethan, maybe we can work something out. I looked out the window toward the distant ridge where Cedar Ridge sat. For the first time since this nightmare began, the balance of power had shifted, and deep down I knew something Richard didn't. The removal order was only the beginning, because once the debris came out, experts were finally going to see what had happened to the stone underneath. And when those test results arrived, the real financial damage would be far worse than anyone imagined. The debris removal started the following week. Truck after truck rolled through the gate. Excavators peeled away layers of dirt the HOA had dumped into the quarry. For a little while, watching that mess disappear felt satisfying, like a wound finally being cleaned out. Then the laboratory reports came back, and everything changed. I'll never forget where I was when Claire called. I was standing beside a loader, eating a gas station sandwich that tasted like cardboard. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. Ethan, she said quietly, we've got contamination. My stomach dropped. The fill material hadn't just covered the stone. It had damaged it. Clay had worked its way into natural fractures. Petroleum residue from broken asphalt had seeped into sections of exposed rock. Fine construction particles had embedded themselves throughout the upper layers of the blue vein. The result was devastating. A huge portion of the stone could no longer be sold as architectural-grade material. Years of value disappeared overnight. I remember sitting on the loader tire after that call, staring across the quarry. Not angry, just exhausted. People hear numbers in lawsuits and think they're imaginary. They aren't. Every dollar represents something real. A contract, a paycheck, a truck payment, a future plan. That contaminated stone represented years of work I could never get back. The damage calculations started piling up fast. Lost inventory, lost contracts, site restoration, testing costs, operational delays, professional assessments. Everything added together into a number that honestly shocked even me. The lawsuit moved quickly after that. The evidence was overwhelming. The permits, the photographs, the state findings, the contamination reports, and most importantly, Richard's email. That one email followed him everywhere. Every hearing, every filing, every argument. The HOA's attorneys tried everything. They claimed the board believed the quarry had been abandoned. The records proved otherwise. They claimed community safety concerns. The state found no emergency. They claimed they acted in good faith. Then the email showed up again. Every road led back to that email. The one where they discussed waiting until I was out of town. The one that turned a mistake into intent. The courtroom itself wasn't dramatic like television. No surprise witnesses. No shouting. No last-minute confessions. Mostly paperwork. Experts. Documents. Facts. But sometimes facts hit harder than drama. The final hearing lasted less than a day. When the judge began reading the decision, the room became so quiet you could hear pages turning. I remember looking straight ahead. Not at Richard. Not at the HOA board members. Just straight ahead. The judgment covered destruction of mineral assets, business losses, restoration costs, and additional penalties tied to intentional interference. The final number landed like a wrecking ball. Several $1 million. Enough that I actually heard someone behind me exhale sharply. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The fight that had consumed nearly a year of my life was suddenly over. At least on paper. But judgments and money are two different things. The real fallout started afterward. Residents began asking questions. Lots of questions. Who approved this? Who voted for it? Who knew about the risks? Who read the legal opinions? Who authorized the dumping contracts? People who had never attended a single HOA meeting suddenly wanted answers. The neighborhood that once spoke with one voice fractured into a dozen different camps. Some blamed Richard. Some blamed the board. Some blamed the attorneys. A few blamed me. I understood that part. When people are scared, they look for somewhere to point their anger. Then came the insurance decision. Denied. The carrier determined the actions were intentional and fell outside coverage protections. That was the moment the panic became real. Because suddenly there was no giant insurance company writing checks. There was only the HOA and the bill. Within months, the association entered bankruptcy proceedings. Assets were frozen. Projects stopped. Reserve funds disappeared into legal obligations. The clubhouse eventually closed. The organization that once controlled every mailbox color, every fence design, every lawn violation notice simply ceased to exist. As for Richard, I heard he filed personal bankruptcy not long afterward. I never celebrated that. Honestly, by then I was too tired. People always expect revenge stories to end with some triumphant moment. The hero wins. The villain loses. Everybody cheers. Real life isn't usually that clean. A few months after the judgment, I ran into an older couple from Cedar Ridge at a hardware store. They recognized me immediately. The husband stood there awkwardly holding a box of screws. Finally, he said, "You're Ethan, right?" I nodded. He looked down for a second, then back up. "We voted against the whole thing," his wife quietly added. Most of us didn't know how far it had gone. I believed them. The husband extended his hand. "For what it's worth, you were right." I shook his hand. And honestly, that meant more to me than I expected. Because this story was never really about money. It wasn't even about the quarry. Not entirely. It was about something a lot of communities forget. There's a difference between having authority and having ownership. There's a difference between influence and entitlement. And there's a dangerous line people cross when they become convinced that their preferences matter more than someone else's rights. About a year later, I stood on the quarry floor during a late-night blast. The benches were clean again. The equipment was running. The blue vein was producing stone. Work had finally returned to normal. I gave a signal. The charge detonated. A deep, controlled boom rolled through the earth and echoed into the hills beyond. For a moment, I watched the dust drift through the floodlights and disappear into the night sky. Then I smiled. Not because I had won, because the quarry was still there. After everything that happened, it was still there. And maybe that's the lesson. People can bury your work. They can underestimate you. They can convince themselves they know what's best for your property, your business, or your life. But eventually reality shows up. And reality tends to be a lot heavier than dirt. Now I'm curious what you think. If you lived in that neighborhood, would you have trusted the HOA leadership? Would you have supported filling the quarry if you believed it was dangerous? And if you were in my position, after everything that happened, would you have pursued every dollar available under the law? Or would you have settled for less to spare the community? Let me know in the comments. I read far more of them than people think. And sometimes the most interesting part of a story isn't what happened. It's what people believe should have happened instead.